All right, this is my third video walking through the very basic first part of an outline. Now I'm going to talk about the first part of the outline. The rest of the outline kind of follows suit, but this is one that's going to help you understand the concept and how we progress through this entire thing, right? So probably by now in class you have talked about your short story and how you basically, the very first part of your intro, you're summing up the story that you read. And then the middle part, this is what we call that turn, that hook. This is what the story made me think about. So then you would say, this story made me think about violence in cities or gun ownership or transgender rights or technology of some sort, yada, 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 right? And then we get to our thesis. Now, if you look at my example up here was from a former student, so I just grabbed that because I didn't develop an intro for this. But I did write a thesis for my original paper topic, which is gun violence and things like that in the city, right? So here's how I made my thesis. Gun violence within cities is a problem due to unnecessary death. Therefore, we need to regulate guns in order to reduce violence in America, right? I moved to a point, talked about why it's a problem, and now I said to myself, all right, how did I develop that? One, I used my fancy-dancy thesis template that I have up here, but also looking at, this is the information I found. Current gun violence, why people are protective of gun rights. Might change that one over later. But banning automatic and semi-automatic guns, I think that's a good way to help reduce gun violence in America. So here's my thesis, and I said it's a problem because of this thing. Got a lot of people dying. It's a lot. That's kind of a problem. One person dying from guns is one person too many, right? So here we have all this. We need to regulate guns in order to reduce that violence. So I have these things, right? So how do I organize my thought? So I take my first topic, current gun violence. I'm going to scroll on down to this guy right here. And I'm going to paste it in my first topic. Okay? Same thing like the papers we've done in the past. We have to start off with a claim. We have to develop our idea. So I am looking at current gun violence as my first topic. So I like to start my papers like this because I like to think when I'm writing a paper like this is going to be my background. It's going to develop a lot of information on my topic, right? It's the one that says, here's my information. I'm not going to move to my point yet, but I got to establish all the information so that later on I can talk about that, right? So if I were a person and I was making an argument about something, I would basically say, all right, here's my theory, here's my point, but before I get to that point, I'm going to back it up with a lot of background information, a lot of stuff that kind of beefs up my point, right? And that's what this topic is going to do, right? So that's why I have this one. The second one is probably going to be more about gun ownership. It could move to why people are so protective of their gun rights, right? Because people are going to be protective of gun rights, especially if there's gun violence, right? If there are people dying, people are going to be like, well, I need a gun too to protect myself, right? Makes sense. I understand it. So then here we are, current gun violence. So moving to that thing and why this paragraph is so important, we need to know things before we talk about what's down below. And that's how I set up my claim up here. In order to understand why we need better gun regulations, we first need to understand how guns can harm a person's life. So this is how I think of it in my head. In order to understand my third topic, we first need to understand my first topic, right? So that's what I wrote here. In order to understand why we need better gun regulations, down, 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 we first need to understand how guns can harm a person's life, which is right here, right? 25 years ago, I didn't have to go through school shooter scenarios at school. I would go to school and everything was fine. See, this is my personal experience, and this helps me validate why I'm so interested in this. 25 years ago, as a kid going through high school, I didn't have to worry about school shootings and things like that. Not until Columbine, which was, 1999? So I had 3 good years there, kids, of before I had to worry about all this stuff, right? So then I moved to my information. In the article Where Bullets Fly, Violence in the Cities, it documents violence in cities and how inner city violence exists because of lack of opportunity of youth. It also brings up the statistics of who owns guns regardless of location. So all I did in this is build up the credibility and the idea of what this source was about, right? I'm building that idea. I'm building the information here. And then I'm going to move to my quote. So again, like our analysis paper that we've written in the past, I'm building up here to get to that quote. Now my quote says here, 39% of men and 22% of women own a gun. Half of all white men are gun owners compared to a quarter of men of color, a quarter of white women, and 16% of women of color. It's a pretty big stat, right? So I'm going to paraphrase that because it has a lot of stats in there. And I said roughly 40% of men and 20% of women own guns, and of that 40%, half are white men, right? So that's what we call paraphrasing. It's taking the information, reducing it a little bit to easier to digest parts. And you could do that a ton with stats. You know, if it said over 1 million people die because of gun violence each year, that's a paraphrase rather than saying 1,452,629 people die, right? I don't need to have all that stuff. I can just say roughly 1 million people die each year of that thing and then go on into that. Now, if I do that, I still got to give credit where credit's due. Where did I get that stat? And that's why I have that guy right there, right? And then I go on and I analyze that bit of information right there, okay? And then I progress through this entire thing, okay? I'm going to stop there because I don't want to make this video any longer than that. But that's how we start off that first part, okay?